The wind howled through the dark night, shaking the shutters on the Thornton Ranch house. At exactly midnight, 3 sharp knocks echoed against the wooden door, cutting through the silence of the storm. Jacob Thornton, weary from a long day of farming and still grieving his wife's recent death, hesitated before answering. His arms ached, his heart heavier than it had ever been. But when he opened the door, a soaked woman stood in the rain. Her dress was torn, her face pale with exhaustion, and her hands trembled from the cold. In her arms, she cradled a small bundle, and the faint sound of a baby crying broke through the storm. "I heard you need help," she said, her voice soft but sure. "I can work." Without waiting for an invitation, she reached toward the baby. Jacob froze, unsure what to do. But, feeling desperate, he handed the infant over. In a moment, the baby's cries ceased. Silence filled the night, broken only by the storm's roar. Who was this stranger, and what was she running from? Jacob stared in disbelief as the woman, without a word, expertly calmed the baby in her arms. Her movements were gentle but practiced, as though she had done this 1,000 times before. Within minutes, the baby, his baby, Thomas, was fast asleep, nestled against her chest, no longer crying. Jacob felt a weight lift from his chest that he hadn't even known he'd been carrying. "How did you do that?" he murmured, more to himself than her. The woman looked up, her tired eyes meeting his for the first time. She offered a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I've been a nanny. My mother was a midwife," she said softly, her voice now steady despite the rain pouring down around them. Jacob stepped back, motioning for her to come inside. She nodded and entered, her damp clothes leaving water droplets on the floor. Jacob watched, still in shock, as she set about working without hesitation. She moved through the kitchen, wiping down counters, gathering the dishes from the previous day's meal. A few minutes later, she had started brewing coffee, the rich aroma filling the room. Jacob stood frozen by the door, the baby still in her arms, watching her work as though she had belonged there all along. He couldn't help but feel a strange mix of gratitude and unease. A stranger in his home, a woman who seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, offering help in his darkest hour. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, Jacob found the woman still busy at work. The kitchen was spotless, the coffee brewed, and a soft fire crackled in the hearth. Jacob had been awake for hours, unable to shake the odd feeling that had settled in his stomach. As he stood in the doorway, trying to gather his thoughts, the sound of heavy footsteps approached. It was Tomas, the ranch hand, followed by old Pete, the oldest of the crew. They stopped in their tracks when they saw the woman. "Who's this?" Tomas asked, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. Before Jacob could answer, the woman turned toward them, offering a calm smile. "My name's Lavisa Brennan," she said, her voice clear. "I can cook, clean, mend, and handle animals." Jacob cleared his throat. He hadn't even asked her name yet. "Why midnight? Why here?" he asked, his voice gruff with both curiosity and lingering suspicion. Lavisa paused, as if carefully considering her words. "I heard you lost your wife. I heard you needed help." Her gaze briefly flickered toward the baby, now sleeping soundly in a cradle by the fire. Jacob nodded, trying to process everything. His mind raced, but he couldn't find a single answer to the questions that swirled in his head. Who was this woman? Why had she come to his doorstep at this hour? And most importantly, what was she running from? Later, as the sun rose higher in the sky, Jacob noticed something strange. Lavisa had no belongings, nothing but the worn canvas bag she had carried inside with her. It was small, no bigger than a sack of flour, and seemed to contain only the barest of necessities. Her hands were trembling slightly as she unpacked, and Jacob saw a faint bruise on her wrist, barely noticeable under the sleeves of her dress. Jacob cleared his throat and approached her. "I can offer you room and board, and a small wage for your work. You can leave whenever you want." His voice was kind but firm, a little too much of both for his own liking. He wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, but after seeing her care for Thomas, he couldn't bring himself to turn her away. Levisa's shoulders seemed to relax at the offer, a visible relief in her posture. She glanced at him, her eyes briefly meeting his before she looked away. "Thank you," she whispered, almost too quietly to hear. Jacob gave a short nod and gestured toward the house. He showed her around, leading her to the unused rooms. His wife's room, untouched since her death, still held the faint scent of lavender. The nursery, where the crib stood untouched for days, was still and silent. Levisa observed it all silently. As they entered the baby's room, she quietly noted, "He needs routine. Babies sense grief." Her words stung more than Jacob had expected. As Levisa unpacked her bag, a small piece of torn paper fell out, fluttering to the ground. Jacob didn't see it, but Levisa did. Her face went pale, and her breath caught in her throat as she quickly picked it up. The paper, a piece of a wanted poster with a woman's sketch on it, disappeared into her bag before Jacob could even blink. He didn't ask about it, but the unease settled deeper in his chest. Who was this woman, and why was she hiding her past so carefully? Levisa spent the next few days settling into the house, her every movement quietly cleaning and organizing, as though she were trying to outrun something unspoken, hidden deep inside her. Jacob couldn't help but notice how she kept her distance from certain things. The room that had once belonged to his late wife, Elizabeth, was still just as she had left it, untouched for months, a silent shrine to a love now lost. Levisa's gaze lingered there once, her expression unreadable, before quickly moving away, as though the room's stillness was too much for her to bear. As she continued working, Jacob could see the weariness in her eyes, the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking, and the way she flinched at sudden movements, as if she expected a blow to come at any moment. He didn't push for answers, but it wasn't long before the town began to take notice. Mrs. Holloway, the busybody of the town, didn't waste any time in voicing her concerns, practically accusing Jacob of being too quick to bring a strange woman into his house. "Jacob doesn't need some vagrant raising that baby," she sneered, her sharp eyes flicking to Levisa, who, though she stood silently, could feel the weight of the words like a physical blow. Tomas, ever the defender of the underdog, stepped in, pointing out that the baby only slept through the night because of Levisa's care, a truth that seemed to silence the gossip, though it didn't stop it from swirling. Levisa, for her part, said little, retreating into the background as Jacob faced the growing whispers of the town. But as the days passed, Jacob saw something in her, a quiet strength, something buried under layers of grief and fear, and he couldn't help but wonder if she was running from more than just the stormy night she had knocked on his door. One evening, as Levisa sang a lullaby in a language Jacob didn't recognize, something soft and foreign, perhaps German or Polish, he asked her about it. She explained, in a voice that cracked with emotion, that her mother had passed away when she was young, and the lullabies were all she had left of her. It was in this moment of shared grief that Jacob finally opened up, telling her about Elizabeth, about how childbirth had taken his wife, and how he was still failing to care for his son, even after all this time. Levisa, ever the caretaker, reassured him with quiet words. "You kept him alive. That's not failing," she said, her voice steady. "Now let me help you thrive." In that small exchange, a bond began to form between them, one that was built on shared pain, but also on the promise of something more. The next day, Jacob took Levisa to town to gather supplies. As they entered the general store, Sheriff Martin was there, looking up from the counter as they approached. He raised an eyebrow at Levisa, his gaze lingering a little too long. "Where you from, miss?" he asked, his voice suspicious, and Levisa froze, her eyes darting to the wall where several wanted posters hung. Jacob noticed her change in demeanor, her sudden stillness, and felt a knot tighten in his stomach. When they left the store, a stranger on horseback, rough-looking and rugged, watched them from a distance, his gaze never leaving Lavisa as they rode away. Jacob felt a shiver run down his spine as he turned to her. "What are you running from?" he asked, his voice low. Lavisa's response was a quiet one, almost a whisper. "A life I couldn't survive. That's all you need to know." But that night, Jacob heard the sound of hooves outside the house. Peering out the window, he saw the stranger circling the property before riding off into the dark. Lavisa didn't mention it to him, but Jacob noticed the knife she'd kept hidden under her pillow the next morning, and he knew then that something far darker was in her past than she was willing to share. Days passed, and the rhythm of life on the ranch began to settle. The storm had faded, leaving behind a quiet calm that felt almost unnatural after the chaos of the last few weeks. Lavisa, once a stranger with nothing but a canvas bag and a quiet fear in her eyes, was becoming part of the household, and with each passing day, Jacob found himself leaning on her more. She helped with the baby, soothing Thomas in ways he could never manage, gently rocking him to sleep with lullabies in that strange foreign tongue of hers. Jacob, unsure of how to be a father since Elizabeth's death, learned from her, soaking in every piece of advice she offered. His routine matters, Lavisa would tell him. Children sense more than we know. The house began to feel different, more alive. Where it had once been filled with the hollow silence of grief, now it was filled with the sounds of life. Laughter, the soft coo of a baby, the light hum of Lavisa's singing. In turn, Jacob showed her the things she didn't know, like how to properly ride a horse, how to shoot a rifle for protection, and the careful art of keeping the cattle in line. They worked together in harmony, and soon enough, something more than a working relationship began to grow between them. Their hands would brush as they passed the baby back and forth, lingering just a moment too long. They caught each other's eyes more often, and with every glance, the tension between them grew. There were quiet moments, too, moments that were too intimate to ignore. Like the time when Jacob caught her mending clothes by the firelight, the shadows dancing across her face as he watched her, feeling the weight of the attraction that had been growing between them. It wasn't just the physical closeness, though that was undeniable. It was the emotional connection, the shared pain, the unspoken understanding that seemed to tie them together. Thomas had his first steps one afternoon, wobbling across the room as Jacob and Lavisa both watched in awe. When the baby fell into Jacob's arms, both of them cried, tears of joy, a release they hadn't known they needed. It was in that moment, as they stood together with Thomas between them, that the line between them blurred. Jacob almost kissed her then, a moment that felt as inevitable as it was terrifying, but the cry of the baby broke the spell, and they both laughed awkwardly, stepping back, unsure of what to do with the raw emotion that had suddenly surged between them. The tenderness in their bond had grown too strong to ignore, but there were still ghosts lurking between them, secrets that neither had fully revealed. The darkness of Lavisa's past, the mystery of who she truly was something Jacob couldn't shake from his mind. One night, his fears were confirmed in the worst way. Jacob woke to Lavisa's screams. Her cries were full of terror, the kind of terror that could only come from reliving a nightmare. He rushed to her side, gently shaking her awake as she thrashed in the bed, her hands clutching at the sheets. "Please, I'll be good. No more," she screamed, her voice breaking. Jacob held her, trying to calm her, but Lavisa was trembling, her face twisted in fear. She woke with a start, her eyes wide and glassy, as though she hadn't even realized where she was. For a long moment, she was silent, her breaths coming in short gasps. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean to wake you." Jacob sat beside her, unsure of what to say, his heart aching for her. After a long silence, she spoke again, this time in a low, broken voice. "I was married," she began, the words almost impossible to hear. "His name was Daniel Brennan. He drank. When he drank, he hurt me. Jacob's stomach twisted as she pulled back the sleeves of her dress to reveal scars on her arms and back, the remnants of the beatings she had endured. I waited until he passed out drunk, took what I could carry, and ran, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He's looking for me. The law's on his side, he still claims me. The truth hit Jacob like a punch to the gut. The woman he had come to care for, who had become a mother to his son, was running from a man who had once called her his property. Lavisa lowered her eyes, ashamed, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. No one owns you, Jacob said, his voice low but firm. Not him, not anyone. She met his gaze then, her eyes filled with tears. The law says differently, she replied softly. A wife who abandons her husband is a criminal. The words stung, and Jacob felt a deep rage rise within him. He wanted to protect her, to make everything right, but he didn't know how. He pulled her close, his arms around her, offering what little comfort he could. Then we'll change what the law sees, he promised, the words echoing in the quiet room. But Lavisa wasn't so sure. The fear that had been buried in her eyes for so long now surfaced, and Jacob realized just how much she was still running from. Despite their growing connection, the past was always there, lurking, waiting to catch up with them. The next day, Jacob took Lavisa to town for supplies, trying to distract her from the weight of their conversation. As they walked through the store, Sheriff Martin was there, his sharp eyes immediately landing on Lavisa. Where you from, miss? He asked, his voice casual, but his eyes studying her closely. Lavisa froze, her face paling as she glanced at the wall behind him. Jacob followed her gaze and saw the wanted posters for missing women, their faces hauntingly familiar. His heart skipped a beat. Lavisa quickly turned away, her footsteps quickening. The sheriff didn't seem to notice, but Jacob did, and a sense of unease settled in his chest. As they left the store, a stranger watched them from across the street, his weathered face obscured by the brim of his hat. He didn't approach, but his gaze never left Lavisa as they passed. The man looked rough, like someone who had seen too much of the world's darker side. Jacob felt his stomach tighten. Something was wrong. What are you running from? Jacob asked quietly as they rode home, his eyes on the road ahead. Lavisa didn't answer at first, and when she did, her voice was almost a whisper. A life I couldn't survive. That's all you need to know. Jacob didn't press her further, but the weight of her words hung between them like a storm cloud. That night, as they lay in bed, Jacob heard the sound of hooves outside. He crept to the window, his heart pounding in his chest, and saw the stranger from the street, riding around the property. When a man finally rode off into the darkness, Jacob's blood ran cold. He turned back to Lavisa, but she was already asleep, her breathing steady. Still, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He didn't know it then, but that was just the beginning of the danger that was coming their way. And as the days passed, Jacob realized that no matter how much he cared for Lavisa, the ghosts of her past were closing in on them, and there was little he could do to protect them from what was coming. Jacob had never seen Daniel Brennan in person before, but the moment he saw the man on horseback, standing at the edge of the property with fire in his eyes, Jacob knew the storm they had been waiting for had finally arrived. The man was everything Lavisa had described, rough, unkempt, and, as Jacob could tell from the moment he spoke, filled with rage. He didn't waste any time. Lavisa, I know you're in there. Get out here, wife. Daniel's voice was like a growl, full of venom, as if the mere sight of her was enough to fuel his anger. Jacob stood his ground, rifle in hand, his body tense as Lavisa appeared behind him, holding Thomas. That's my wife. Law says she belongs to me, Daniel sneered, holding up a marriage certificate as though it were some kind of weapon. He made no attempt to hide his arrogance, fully expecting Jacob to back down. Sheriff already knows, Daniel continued, the mocking tone never leaving his voice. Woman can't just abandon her husband. I've been tracking you for 8 months. You made me look like a fool." Lavisa stood frozen beside Jacob, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. Jacob felt the protective instinct surge inside him, pushing away the anger and confusion. "She's not going anywhere," Jacob said, his voice firm, but Daniel wasn't listening. "This ain't your concern, Thornton. I've got rights," he spat, his eyes narrowing. As Jacob took a step forward, the wind rustling through the trees, Daniel raised his hand, holding up the certificate once more, as if it were a shield. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. Jacob felt the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders like a heavy burden. The law was clear, but Jacob wasn't going to let that dictate what happened next. Daniel's arrival had shattered the fragile peace they had built, and Jacob knew that nothing would ever be the same. The standoff between the two men stretched on, with neither one willing to back down. But then, like a surge of electricity, the air shifted, and Jacob was no longer alone. Tomas and old Pete, the two men who had worked alongside him for years, emerged from the barn, their rifles in hand. The sight of the three men standing together, armed and ready, made Daniel pause for a moment, but only for a brief instant. "I've changed, Lavisa," Daniel shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "I'll be better. Just come home. We can fix this." But Lavisa wasn't fooled by his words. She had lived through his empty promises, through the pain and the brokenness of their marriage. "You said that after every beating," she replied, her voice steady but full of bitterness. Jacob watched as the rage in Daniel's eyes turned to something darker, something more dangerous. "You're mine. I own you," Daniel snarled, stepping forward, his fists clenched, his movements wild. In that moment, Jacob knew this wasn't just about law or property. It was about control. And Daniel wasn't about to let go of the one thing he had left to control. With a shout, Daniel lunged forward, but Jacob was faster. He tackled Daniel to the ground, their bodies crashing against the dirt, and the struggle for dominance began. It was brutal. Jacob knew how to fight, but Daniel was strong, and his anger gave him a ferocity Jacob hadn't anticipated. They rolled in the dirt, each man trying to land a punch, each struggling to maintain control. But then, Lavisa's voice cut through the chaos. "Stop," she shouted, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to freeze. "Stop, now." She stood there, holding the rifle, her hands shaking, but her voice commanding. She raised the rifle in the air and fired a shot into the sky. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, and Jacob and Daniel froze, both of them momentarily stunned. Lavisa pointed the rifle directly at Daniel, her eyes hard as steel. "Leave, now, or the next bullet is for you," she said, her voice unwavering. Daniel stared at her, disbelief etched across his face. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Daniel backed off, his anger still burning in his eyes, but his hands held up in surrender. "This ain't over, Thornton," he muttered. "The law will be here tomorrow. I'll make sure of it." With that, he turned and rode off, disappearing into the distance. Jacob stood, his body sore from the fight, his hands still gripping the rifle. But Lavisa didn't let go of the rifle. She held it steady, her hands now calm, though her eyes remained vigilant. Jacob could feel her fear, but there was something else there too, something stronger. She wasn't just the woman he had come to care for. She was a survivor, and in that moment, Jacob realized just how much strength she had. As the tension slowly began to fade, the weight of what had just happened settled in. The danger was far from over. The next day, Sheriff Martin arrived with his deputy, and despite the resolution of the standoff, the law still stood in the way. "She's a married woman, Jake," the sheriff said, his voice sympathetic but firm. "She has to return to her husband." Jacob fought to keep his frustration in check, but he could feel the weight of the sheriff's words like a heavy burden. Lavisa stood by his side, her shoulders slumped as if the weight of her past was threatening to crush her. I won't bring more trouble here, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'll go. Jacob's heart broke for her, but he wasn't ready to give up. No, he said, his voice low but resolute. There has to be a way. Just as he was about to argue further, old Pete, who had been silently observing, spoke up. What if the marriage ain't legal? He asked, his voice calm but laced with curiosity. Jacob turned to him, confused. What do you mean? Pete looked at Lavisa, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. What if she was married before Daniel, and that husband died? What if Daniel's marriage is invalid? The question hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped spinning. Lavisa's breath caught in her throat, and she turned to Pete, her face pale. She said, her voice barely a whisper, at 16, to Thomas Mueller from my village. Cholera took him after 6 months. Her words hit Jacob like a ton of bricks. If her first marriage was still valid, then Daniel's claim on her was worthless. If I was already widowed, she continued, then Daniel's marriage might be void. The sheriff's eyes widened, and he quickly motioned to one of the deputies. Do you have proof of this first marriage? He asked. Lavisa nodded and reached in her bag. She pulled out a small, worn piece of paper, an old church record. The sheriff looked it over carefully. It's legitimate, he said, his voice filled with surprise. But as they celebrated, a shadow loomed over them. From a distance, Daniel watched, and as night fell, he set fire to the barn. Papers burn, so do witnesses, he muttered under his breath as the flames grew. The fire raged out of control, but it wasn't just the barn that was burning. It was everything they had fought for. And as Jacob, Lavisa, and the others fought the flames, they knew that Daniel's fight was far from over. The night the fire started was one that Jacob would never forget. The crackling flames spreading quickly from the barn to the surrounding fields, the sky tinted orange as the fire grew in intensity. Lavisa woke with a start, the smell of smoke heavy in the air, and panic rose in her chest as she grabbed Thomas from his crib, holding him tightly against her chest. Jacob was already up, rushing through the house, grabbing the marriage document that had suddenly become the key to their freedom. He rushed to Lavisa's side, his heart pounding as they made their way outside, the heat from the fire already making the air oppressive. Tomas and old Pete, who had been sleeping in the barn, were already outside, shouting orders to the few neighbors who had gathered to help. The fire spread quickly, the wind carrying embers, threatening to take down the house if they didn't act fast. Jacob's mind raced, trying to figure out what to do, but he didn't have time to think. The fire was a living thing, a beast that refused to be tamed, and every second mattered. Lavisa clutched Thomas tightly, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't hesitate. She followed Jacob as he led them away from the burning barn, moving quickly toward the well. They joined the bucket brigade, each person passing water as quickly as they could, their hands slick with sweat as they fought to save what was left of their home. But it wasn't enough. The barn was already lost. The fire was so intense that it threatened to engulf everything in its path, but they couldn't stop. With each passing minute, the flames seemed to creep closer to the house, the heat unbearable, the smoke thick in the air. The neighbors worked frantically, but Jacob's thoughts were on Lavisa and Thomas, on making sure they were safe, that nothing happened to them. As the fire raged on, he could see the determination in Lavisa's eyes, the same strength that had carried her through so much of her life, even though she hadn't let anyone see it until now. In the chaos of the night, Jacob realized just how much she had changed their lives. She had brought light back into this house. She had made Thomas laugh for the first time in weeks, and now she was helping to save what little they had left. The fire eventually began to die down, but not before it had left its mark. The barn was a charred shell, the animals they had worked so hard to care for now lost in the ashes. The house had been spared, but the damage was still significant. The walls were singed, the roof compromised, and the property was littered with the remnants of what had once been their life. Lavisa, though shaken, was strong through all. She never once hesitated, never once showed weakness. And as they finally stopped working to catch their breath, Jacob saw her for who she truly was, a woman who had survived more than he could imagine. But the battle wasn't over. As the night wore on and the last of the fire was extinguished, Sheriff Martin arrived with his deputy, his face grim. Jacob felt his stomach tighten as the sheriff approached, his eyes scanning the damage before they landed on Jacob. Daniel's flask was found near the point of origin, Sheriff Martin said, his voice calm but filled with accusation. Looks like he set the fire. That's arson, and he's going to pay for it. Jacob nodded, his fists clenched as he tried to keep his emotions in check. It was a small victory, but the damage was done. Daniel had taken more from them than just their property. He had taken their peace, and now he had taken their security. The sheriff turned to Lavisa, his eyes softening. "You've been through enough, Lavisa," he said, his voice filled with sympathy. "This has gone on long enough." But Jacob wasn't ready to let it end like this. He didn't care about the law or what Daniel thought. He only cared about Lavisa, about making sure she and Thomas were safe. "What about Daniel?" Jacob asked, his voice low, full of urgency. "What happens now?" Sheriff Martin paused, his expression troubled. "We'll catch him," he said, his voice grim. "But you know how it goes. He's got friends in town. We'll have to go through the courts, but we'll get him. He'll face justice." But Jacob wasn't so sure. Daniel had already shown how far he was willing to go to get what he wanted. Jacob turned to Lavisa, his eyes full of concern. "You don't have to go back to him," he said quietly. "We'll find a way to make this right." Lavisa met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "I don't want to go back to him," she whispered. "But what if he comes after us again? What if he's never really gone?" Jacob took her hand, his grip tight, reassuring. "I'll protect you. I swear it." The days that followed were a blur of activity. The neighbors helped rebuild the barn, bringing food and supplies, their gestures full of kindness and regret for having judged Lavisa so quickly when she first arrived. Mrs. Holloway, the town's busiest gossip, was among the first to apologize, bringing food and offering words of comfort. "You're good for him," Mrs. Holloway said, her tone softer than it had ever been. "Good for that baby." Elizabeth would approve. It was a small gesture, but it was one that Lavisa appreciated. Slowly, the town began to accept her, and Jacob could see it in the way people looked at her now, with respect, not suspicion. The day the barn was finished, Jacob felt a sense of accomplishment that had eluded him for months. The community had come together, but there was still one thing left to do. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the land, Jacob found Lavisa standing alone, watching the sky turn pink and orange. He approached her quietly, unsure of how to put into words what he was feeling. But as he reached her side, he knew what he had to do. "Lavisa," he said, his voice steady, "we've been through a lot, and there's still so much to face. But I can't imagine my life without you in it. I don't just want you here for Thomas. I want you here for me." Lavisa looked at him, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, Jacob thought she might say something to push him away, something to remind him of her past and the scars she carried. But instead, she just nodded. "Jacob," she said softly, "I'm still legally." "Your first marriage ended with Thomas's death," Jacob interrupted gently. "Your second marriage was void. You're a free woman." He knelt before her, taking her hand in his. "Marry me, not because you need protection, not because you have to, but because you want to, because you love us too." Lavisa's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Just as Jacob stood, his heart full, Thomas let out a joyful laugh from the porch, and the sound filled the air like music. For the first time in a long while, everything felt right. But as Jacob held Lavisa, a cold wind blew through the trees, and in the distance, a telegram was arriving at the sheriff's office. Prisoner Daniel Brennan escaped during transport. Whereabouts unknown. Sheriff Martin would ride out immediately toward the Thorn Ranch. The battle wasn't over yet, and the storm was far from finished. But for the first time in a long time, Jacob and Lavisa had something worth fighting for, and together they would face whatever came next. The day of their wedding dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the chaos that had preceded it, and yet there was an unmistakable tension in the air. The barn, now rebuilt by the community with hands that had once been hesitant and suspicious, stood as a symbol of resilience, its wooden beams strong and steady, much like the love that had blossomed between Jacob and Lavisa. It wasn't the grandest of weddings, but it was theirs, a small ceremony, intimate and warm, with only the closest of friends and family present. Lavisa stood in a simple white dress, her hair softly braided, holding Thomas in her arms, her eyes shining with an emotion Jacob had come to recognize as love. Jacob, dressed in his best suit, stood by her side, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched her. It was a far cry from the grief-stricken man who had first met her at midnight, holding his crying baby, unsure of what to do or where to turn. Now he was standing at the altar, preparing to vow his life to her, the woman who had brought light back into his world. The preacher, a local man who had long known Jacob and Lavisa, began the ceremony with a warm, steady voice. The crowd of neighbors, friends, and family stood around them, their faces filled with smiles and admiration. It wasn't the life Jacob had envisioned, but in that moment, it was perfect. As the preacher spoke the words that would make them husband and wife, the tension in the air seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of peace that had long eluded them. Just as Jacob was about to speak his vows, the doors of the barn suddenly flew open, and Sheriff Martin burst in, his face pale with urgency. "Daniel's escaped," he said, his voice laced with fear. "He's coming." The entire room froze in shock. The ceremony came to a screeching halt as everyone turned to look at the sheriff, the joy of the moment slipping away like sand through their fingers. Jacob's stomach tightened as the reality of what that meant hit him. Daniel wasn't finished with them, not by a long shot. He had already shown what he was capable of, and now, with the knowledge that Lavisa was about to marry Jacob, there was no telling how far he would go. "You need to leave. Now," the sheriff ordered, his voice filled with urgency. "I'll handle this. Get everyone inside the house. Stay there until I say otherwise." The room erupted into chaos as people began to scramble, rushing to protect their families. Lavisa, holding Thomas tightly, stepped back, her face pale. "I'm not hiding," she said, her voice steady but full of fear. "I'm done running." Jacob's heart raced as he stepped forward, taking her hand. He knew she was right. She couldn't hide forever, and she shouldn't have to. Daniel had already taken enough from them. It was time to stop running, time to stand and face him, once and for all. "We'll face this together," Jacob said firmly, looking around at the people who had once been so quick to judge Lavisa, but who now stood by them, ready to help. "Everyone stay inside. Keep the doors locked," Sheriff Martin ordered as he and his deputy prepared to leave the barn, heading toward the direction where Daniel's horse had been seen earlier. Jacob turned to Lavisa, his grip tight on her hand. "We can't let him hurt you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We're going to fight for our future, for Thomas, for everything we've built." Lavisa met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I'm not afraid of him anymore," she said softly. "He can't control me." Just as she finished speaking, the unmistakable sound of hooves outside broke through the silence, and Jacob's heart sank. He could see Daniel in the distance, riding toward the ranch, his horse kicking up dust as he came. There was no turning back now. Daniel was close, and Jacob could feel the danger in the air. The sheriff, his deputy, and a few of the men from the ranch stepped outside, their rifles at the ready. The showdown was coming, and Jacob had no idea how it would end, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let Daniel take Lavisa away from him. Not now. Not ever. As Daniel rode up to the front of the house, he stopped a few yards away, dismounting slowly. His face was dirty, unshaven, his clothes torn and covered in dust. He was a shell of the man Jacob had seen before, and yet there was still a dangerous fire in his eyes, one that burned with a need for control, for revenge. "You think you can just replace me, Jacob?" Daniel spat, his voice filled with venom. "You think you could take her from me?" Jacob stepped forward, the weight of the situation pressing down on his shoulders, but his resolve was firm. "She's not yours, Daniel," Jacob said, his voice steady. "She never was." Daniel's face twisted with anger, his hands clenched into fists as he took a step toward Jacob. "You don't get to decide that," he snarled. "She's my property. The law says I own her." Jacob could feel the tension rising, the air thick with the promise of violence. The men from the ranch, who had gathered in support, stood ready, their hands on their rifles, their eyes locked on Daniel. But Jacob wasn't going to let it come to a fight. Not again. "The law doesn't own her," Jacob said firmly, his voice carrying across the field. "She's free, and she's with me now." The words hung in the air, but Daniel wasn't listening. With a roar of fury, he lunged toward Jacob, his fist raised, but Jacob was ready. In one swift motion, he pulled out his rifle and aimed it at Daniel, the cold steel of the barrel steady in his hands. "Don't come any closer," Jacob warned, his voice low but filled with authority. Daniel stopped in his tracks, his eyes wide with disbelief. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The standoff stretched on, each man locked in a battle of wills, each unwilling to back down. But then something shifted in the air. Lavisa stepped forward, her hand on Jacob's arm, her voice calm but firm. "It ends now, Daniel," she said, her eyes filled with resolve. "You don't owe me. You never did." Daniel's rage was palpable, but something in his eyes flickered at her words. For the first time, he seemed uncertain, as though the weight of his past actions was finally catching up with him. "I made you, Lavisa," he growled, his voice trembling with emotion. "I gave you everything." "No," Lavisa replied, her voice steady. "You took everything from me, but I'm done. I'm done being your victim." Daniel's expression twisted into one of fury, and he moved to lunge at her. But before he could make it, Jacob fired a warning shot into the air, the sound loud and deafening. "Leave. Now," Jacob commanded, his voice unwavering. Daniel paused, his eyes filled with hate, but he didn't move. For a moment, Jacob thought the fight would continue. But then Daniel slowly backed away, his eyes never leaving them as he mounted his horse. "This isn't over, Thornton," Daniel spat, his voice filled with venom. "You'll regret this." With one last glare, he turned his horse and rode off into the distance, disappearing into the trees. Jacob's heart was racing, his body tense. But as Daniel's figure vanished from view, a sense of relief washed over him. It was finally over. The danger had passed. For now, as the sheriff and the men from the ranch moved to follow Daniel, Jacob turned to Lavisa, his heart heavy with the weight of what they had just faced. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Lavisa nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm more than okay," she whispered. "I'm free." That night, after the sheriff had left to deal with the aftermath, Jacob and Lavisa stood together on the porch, looking out over the ranch. The stars above seemed brighter, the air cooler, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jacob felt at peace. "You know, I never thought this day would come," Jacob said softly, his eyes on Lavisa. "I never thought I'd be standing here with you like this." Lavisa smiled, her eyes filled with love. "Neither did I," she said, her voice full of warmth. "But here we are." Jacob took her hand, his grip strong. "We've got everything now. A future, a family." Lavisa squeezed his hand, her gaze soft. "A family," she echoed, her voice thick with emotion. "A family." And as they stood there, holding each other, watching the sunset fade into the night. Jacob knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Because love wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving, about finding the courage to face the darkness and step into the light side by side. The next morning, as they prepared for the wedding once again, there was a knock at the door, a simple, quiet knock. The same kind that changed everything. And this time, when Jacob opened it, he didn't face an uncertain future. He faced a new beginning. The future was theirs to build. And with each passing day, Jacob and Lavisa created something stronger than the past that had once held them captive. Together, they built a life that was no longer defined by fear or loss, but by the love they had found in each other. And in the end, that was all that mattered.